Hi, this is a video for the 5.06 lesson, Tragedies. Americans reeled at the violence of 1968. Cities erupted in anguished riots when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Presidential hopeful Robert Kennedy was slain 3 months later. Anti-war protests grew in number and intensity, and demonstrators at the 1968 Democratic National Convention clashed with Chicago police as the world watched on television. Republican Richard Nixon won the votes of the silent majority of Americans by promising law and order and a plan for Vietnam. But 2 years later, tragedy struck at Kent State and Jackson State universities. Goals for this lesson: list examples of anti-war activity during the Vietnam era and describe the turmoil of the election of 1968. Be sure to go to lesson resources, grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key, and we will begin on page 856. Confrontation and crisis. In the spring of 1968, as cities burned after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., student protests became more widespread and more confrontational. Throughout 1968 and the early 1970s, violence on college campuses and city streets would continue to shock, sadden, and anger many Americans. Campus disturbances. In 1968, college campuses across America were rocked by student protests. At several schools, including Ivy League institutions such as Harvard, Cornell, and Columbia, radicals led forced takeovers of administration and classroom buildings. At Columbia University, located in New York City in the southern edge of Harlem, leaders of the campus SDS chapter paralyzed the university for several days in the spring of 1968 when they occupied classroom buildings in the university president's office. The takeover was originally inspired by the university's decision to build a new gymnasium in one of the few public parks available to neighborhood residents, most of whom were black. SDS denounced the so-called Jim Crow, which benefited Columbia's predominantly white student and faculty population. The Columbia protest quickly evolved into an angry demonstration against multiple targets, including the Vietnam War, economic inequality, and racism. Students occupied and ransacked more buildings. A faculty wife later recalled that revolutionary students spat at people they disliked, including senior faculty members. An old couple crossing the campus was shouted at, "Go home and die, you old people! Go home and die!" University officials called in police who used harsh force against both students and innocent bystanders. The university was forced to cancel classes for the remainder of the semester. Chicago, 1968. The whole world was watching. The volatile mix of student unrest, anti-war frustration, and increasing political polarization ignited in Chicago in the 1968 Democratic National Convention. A look back at events leading up to the convention is necessary in order to understand why things went so terribly wrong. In late 1967, President Lyndon Johnson faced widespread disapproval for his handling of the war. From within his own Democratic Party, candidates stepped forward to challenge him for the party's nomination for the presidency in the coming 1968 election. One was Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, who ran as an anti-war candidate. Most people considered him a long shot at best. In the early primary election in New Hampshire, although McCarthy lost to LBJ, he made a strong showing, which caused people to take notice. Days later, Robert F. Kennedy, the former U.S. Attorney General and the brother of the slain president, entered the race for the Democratic nomination. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson surprised the nation by announcing on television that he would not seek re-election and would retire at the end of his term. For a few weeks in the spring of 1968, the announcement excited many Democrats with a sense of possibility. Kennedy and McCarthy were both running as peace candidates, and both, especially RFK, spoke on behalf of the nation's poorest citizens. During his campaign, Kennedy drew large crowds, including many black and Hispanic voters, whom he inspired with a message of racial understanding and economic justice. And here's a picture of Bobby Kennedy, as he was called, campaigning there in Philadelphia. Rising hopes shattered to the ground on April 4th when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Only 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was in California. We had just managed a narrow victory over McCarthy in the state's primary election. He had just addressed his cheering supporters in the ballroom of Los Angeles' Ambassador Hotel. As he was leaving by way of a shortcut through the hotel's kitchen, a deranged gunman stepped forward and shot him. Coming so closely on the heels of the King assassination, RFK's death left millions of people in grief, anger, and confusion. Such was the mood when in the summer of '68, thousands of delegates arrived in Chicago to attend the Democratic National Convention. Joining them were crowds of protesters, most of them young and almost all of them furious with the party's elders, who supported Vice President Hubert Humphrey for the nomination. Humphrey, a close ally of Lyndon Johnson, had not participated in the primary election, but instead worked to gain the support of key leaders within the Democratic Party. Humphrey was known as a liberal advocate for labor causes and civil rights, but his support of LBJ's Vietnam policy angered the New Left. Thousands of young people gathered in Chicago to protest what seemed to be the almost certain nomination of Humphrey for president. Some were student volunteers for McCarthy, who had cut their hair, shaved their beards, and gone clean for Gene. Others were veterans of the MOB, the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which had organized the 1967 March on the Pentagon. Also converging on the Chicago Convention were so-called Yippies, who preferred anarchistic hijinks to serious protest. Led by Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, the Yippies handed out leaflets calling for the legalization of marijuana and other drugs and announced that they would run a pig for president. Outside the convention hall, as more and more protesters gathered, Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley, fearing violence, stationed thousands of police, backed up by National Guardsmen and others. Many of the policemen were working-class Chicagoans. Many had sons fighting in Vietnam and felt resentment and disgust of the anti-war demonstrators. Police and protesters clashed. The police threw tear gas into the crowds and charged in waving their nightsticks. Many demonstrators were beaten and arrested, while the angry crowds chanted, "The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching!" And indeed, the entire chaotic scene was televised to millions of appalled viewers. Hubert Humphrey walked away with his party's nomination, but the Democrats were badly weakened and lost the election to Richard Nixon. The violence of the convention further divided the nation. Many condemned the police, but just as many denounced the anti-war demonstrators and welcomed law and order, even at the end of a nightstick. And here's a picture of police removing a demonstrator outside the Democratic National Convention. And here's just another picture, the National Guard being called out to help police the streets at the Chicago Convention. Anti-war protest and tragedy. Well, let's go back here. Let's read this excerpt here. Nixon appeals to the silent majority. I'm not going to read his whole speech, but I'm just going to read the explanation about it. In late 1969, protests mounted against the Vietnam War, including a massive rally staged in Washington, D.C. Shortly after that demonstration, President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, made a televised address to the nation. He had characterized the protesters as a vocal minority and called upon the silent majority of Americans to support his policies for the war. Oh, I'm going to read it, I guess. In Chicago a few weeks ago, I saw demonstrators carrying signs reading, "Lose in Vietnam, bring the boys home." But as President of the United States, I would be untrue to my oath of office if I allowed the policy of this nation to be dictated by the minority who hold that point of view and who try to impose on the nation by mounting demonstrations in the street. If a vocal minority, however fervent its cause, prevails over reason and the will of the majority, this nation has no future as a free society. I would like to address a word, if I may, to the young people of this nation. I want to end this war so that the energy and dedication of you, our young people, now too often directed into bitter hatred against those responsible for the war, can be turned to the great challenges of peace, a better life for all Americans, a better life for all people on this earth. So tonight to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that. Okay, here we go. Let's continue now with anti-war protest and tragedy. In October of 1969, millions of Americans participated in peace demonstrations around the country. A month later, more than 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. to march in front of the White House. The huge crowd included writers, actors, musicians, middle-class adults, 3 senators, and members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Though the anti-war movement had grown to include Americans from all walks of life, the center of anti-war activism remained in college campuses. Indeed, growing outrage over the war led to violence on many college campuses. In 1969, hundreds of college campuses erupted in angry protests. In the spring of 1970, Nixon's excursion into Cambodia fueled the outrage of many student activists. Around the nation, students gathered in rallies to demand an end to the war. Demonstrations at Kent University in Ohio and Jackson State in Mississippi ended in tragedy. When protests in downtown Kent turned to looting and vandalism, the city's mayor asked the governor to send the National Guard troops to restore order. When the troops arrived on the Kent State campus, they found hundreds of demonstrators surrounding a building in flames. It was an old wooden structure used by the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. National Guard troops used tear gas to disperse the protesters. On Monday, May 4, 1970, a protest rally was scheduled for noon at the Kent State campus. Although university's officials distributed leaflets prohibiting the rally, hundreds of protesters gathered in the Commons, a grassy area on the central campus, and many more watched as spectators while other students simply tried to make their way to class. The protesters were ordered to leave, but they responded with angry shouts and rock throwing. The National Guard troops fired tear gas into the crowd. As the students dispersed, the troops pursued them. For reasons that remain debated to this day, one group of guardsmen turned and fired. Official reports from later investigations say that at least 28 National Guard members fired more than 60 shots in about 13 seconds. Some fired into the ground or in the air. But when the shooting was over, 4 students lay dead and 9 others were wounded. Here's a picture showing one of the dead. In later court proceedings, some guardsmen testified they fired in self-defense as they felt threatened by the angry crowd. Of the 4 students killed, the closest was approximately 100 yards away from the National Guard troops. 10 days after the killings at Kent State, police shot and killed 2 students during protests at Jackson State, a historically black college in Mississippi. And this is before I turn the page, this is a very famous photograph of the shooting at Kent State. Very iconic of the despair and tragedy that had taken place. More than 400 colleges set down as students and professors demonstrated while 100,000 protesters marched on Washington. Shortly afterward, a government commission reported the Vietnam War had created divisions in American society that were as deep as any since the Civil War. Okay, and then we're going to end here and go back. And you have an online activity to look at. It's Tragedies 2 Centuries Apart. And it says there's some websites to look at.
The Boston Massacre occurred on March 5, 1770, when a group of citizens, angry at the presence of British troops in Boston, goaded soldiers into firing into the crowd. The soldiers killed 5. 200 years later, on May 4, 1970, members of the Ohio National Guard fired into a crowd of angry students at Kent State University, killing 4 and wounding 9. The students were protesting President Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia. Neither incident was actually this simple. Neither one occurred as part of a plan to injure innocent citizens. Both may have unwittingly been incited by the protesters themselves. Both may have been the result of panic. Just what are the parallels, if any, between these 2 incidents to the Boston Massacre, Kent State University, or both? Then drag the phrase to where it belongs in the diagram.
Okay, confrontations occur between soldiers and the crowd. That was in both.
Both in Boston and at Kent State, protesters and demonstrators threw rocks and other objects at the soldiers assigned to maintain order.
Crowds are dispersed with tear gas. Well, they did not have tear gas during the Boston Massacre, so we know that has to be Kent State.
Tear gas causes extreme irritation to the eyes, nose, mouth, and lungs, and temporarily incapacitates a person. Many modern police forces use tear gas to quell riots.
Crowds who gathered include protesters and spectators.
Both in Boston and at Kent State, political activists organized demonstrations that drew many people. Other people watched the demonstrations from a distance, and still others walked past the demonstrators as they went about their daily tasks.
Ohio National Guard troops are assigned to the campus. We know that's Kent State.
After 3 days of unrest and demonstrations at Kent State University and in the town of Kent, the city's mayor asked the governor to send the National Guard to restore order.
Soldiers fire in the crowd. That happened at both.
Both in Boston and at Kent State, soldiers assigned to maintain order fired their weapons into a crowd of people. In each incident, some people were actively protesting, while others were merely watching or passing by.
Panic may have led the soldiers firing to the protesters. Yes, both.
In Boston and at Kent State, the troops who fired lacked the proper training for the situation they were in. Better training may have prevented the incidents. Since the tragedy at Kent State, law enforcement and the National Guard have focused on alternatives to deadly force in situations of civil